We have kind of a backdrop here for what we're going to look at in Matthew chapter 20. Last week, we looked at the rich young ruler, that passage there. And what we saw is that guy, he refused to sell everything and follow Jesus, and he left, and we were told he was grieving because he had much wealth. So the rich young ruler refused to sell everything and left grieving. Jesus then warns his disciples about the danger of riches. And remember the analogy in the picture of the camel going through an eye of a needle? And we talked about how we sometimes try to spiritualize that by saying, well, there's a gate called the needle gate in the wall, and then if you just took everything off the camel and the camel crawled through on its knees, it could get through. And we're like, well, that's dumb because there was never a needle gate. So why would we try to spiritualize? Why not just take it for what it was and say it's impossible for the camel to go through an eye of a needle? It's almost impossible for thread to go through an eye of a needle, let alone a camel. And so he used that to warn his disciple about the dangers of having riches be your idol. And then Peter, whom we love greatly, says, but Jesus, remember me and the boys? We left everything we had to follow you. And then he asked the question, what do we get because of that? It's almost like Peter was saying, Jesus, show me the money. Right? What are we going to get because of this? And what that question did is it revealed really the motives that Peter had in following Jesus, how they were kind of based upon what he could get, but not out of loyalty and love at that moment. But because Jesus cares about Peter, he goes on and he says this. He tells him that, the first will be last and the last will be first. Where these guys were thinking, well, first is first and last is last, right? Kind of like the Olympics. They're not going to give the gold medal to the last place finisher. The first gets the gold and the last gets nothing. And we kind of live with that mentality. The first get the reward, but the last doesn't. But in God's economy, he says it's quite different. It's not the first are first, but it's the last are first, and the first are last. And so in chapter 20, Jesus is going to now illustrate that to the boys by using a parable. He's going to tell us a story. And this story is going to bring clarity really to Jesus as king and his kingdom. So what kind of king Jesus is and what his kingdom looks like, showing us what it would look like for us to live for a different king and a different kingdom in a world that is corrupt like today. So we're going to find great hope on how we conduct ourselves and how we live our lives as we study chapter 20. And so the first thing that we're going to see in the first 7 verses is we're going to look at a sinking landowner and how that kind of associates with Jesus. So verse 1, for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers in his vineyard. Now, when he had agreed with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. So, we need to remember, this is a parable. It's not an actual event. This did not take place. Sometimes we mistake those things when we come to the Bible. We come to them like, oh, okay, yeah, Jesus is telling us a story, and therefore this must have been an actual event. No, Jesus is using this parable to come alongside, because that's what parable means. It means a story that comes alongside an actual event. So what had taken place is what we talked about prior to this, about that conversation Jesus had with his disciples, and now he's going to illustrate that with telling us a parable. There's so many things out there that you can learn on how to study the Bible and how to teach the Bible, and everybody's got their own thing. And one of the things I try to tell anybody that wants to teach the Bible is you need to find out what works for you and use those things. Here's some principles, here's some practices, and you got to kind of come up for yourself what's going to work for you. And for me personally, what I'd like to do is look at what I would call the Jesus model of teaching, which we find here. And Jesus' model is this. It's simplification. So he takes a passage, he simplifies it. He illustrates it, which is what he's going to do now with the parable. And then he shows us how to apply it to our lives. So Jesus' model for teaching is simplification, illustration, and application. And so here's the interesting thing, is the illustrations that Jesus uses would be illustrations that his listeners would understand. They were usually contextual, meaning what was going on in the day. He would use things from there. That's why for you and I, it's a little bit different, because what he's saying that was for a Jewish culture way back then, first century, is a little bit different than it is for those of us in Angels Camp here in 2024. That being said, we have to study. We need to understand the context. That's why context is so important when studying the Bible. So for Jesus' disciples, they would have understood what's going on, and what they would have known is this. When Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like, he's not saying this is what the kingdom of heaven is. He's saying it's like this. He says it's like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. So what we have is a guy who owns grapes. For the disciples, they would have understood that that means it's probably around August time when the rainy season was about to begin. And that what would take place at this time is that usually whoever was the foreman of the guy's grapes would realize that if the rains came, they would lose their crop if they didn't get it picked in a timely manner. So it was very customary for the foreman to be out there and wake up every morning and look at the horizon and see, is there a storm a-coming? What's the weather look like? They didn't have the iPhone where you could check your weather, right, like we do. And they didn't have a 10-day forecast. They had to get up and they had to look. And so what we see here is that this landowner, not foreman, is the guy who's paying attention. And this guy gets up in the morning. He saw rain was coming, so he goes to the town square to hire workers to come help him harvest his grapes. So he had already had some guys harvesting his grapes, but he needed more help. Think of it this way. Home Depot. Right? You show up early in the morning at Home Depot, you're hoping you see a guy with a bucket full of tools that you could hire for really inexpensive, bring him to do your work, and then send him home. Now, obviously, we don't have a Home Depot in Angels Camp. So how would that work? Think Frogville. Hey, looking for work. Yeah, that's my guy. Okay. So this guy goes early in the morning, around 6 a.m., meets these guys, tells them what he needs. They agree upon a price for a denarius a day. That was the same salary that a Roman soldier would have made a day. It would have definitely been a fair wage. So everybody agrees upon this, and away they go. Like I mentioned earlier, it was the landowner who did this, not the foreman. Because what I love about that is it shows us that the landowner is concerned with the harvest. He's concerned about people. And we need to make note of that. And then verse 3 goes on. It says, and he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle in the marketplace and said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. The third hour would be about 9 a.m. So 6 a.m. he went, 9 a.m. he went. What does that mean? That means this, that as the day progressed, the storm was coming, even grew larger. So for the grapes, the storm was getting bigger and bigger, and they were in more and more danger of being lost. So it goes. But to this group, he doesn't agree upon a wage. He just says, you go and work. These guys, but did you notice what they were doing? They were standing idle. So what would that make these guys? That would make these guys the guys that weren't as ambitious as the 6 a.m. crew. The group that was content with just getting getting an application, but not really wanting to work. But at least they could go home and say, well, honey, I was standing there and nobody hired me. You know? Well, this landowner shows up and gives him no excuse. Hey, you want to work? Got work? Go, and I'll pay you what it's fair. I'll pay you something fair. Well, people don't normally do that. People usually want to know what the price is that they're going to get paid before they go. So what this tells me about this landowner is that he must have had a reputation that would have been going before him that said, hey, this guy's a fair guy. I mean, I believe that that's really what Jesus is trying to get at, is that, hey, I've got a good reputation. But he goes on. It says, and he went out about the third hour and saw others standing idle. Verse 5. Again, he went out about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did likewise. And about the 11th hour he went out and found others standing idle. And he said to them, why have you been standing here idle all day? They said to him, because no one hired us. He said to them, you also go into the vineyard, and whatever is right, you will receive. So the 6th hour, noon. So 6, 9, noon. 9th hour, 3, he goes out. 11th hour, 5 p.m., right before closing time, right? The 11th hour, people, Jesus asked, why have you been standing here idle all day? But why were the other groups there? I wonder if the 6th and 9th hour groups were the ones that already went out early in the morning and came back and were hoping that there might be later work. But the 11th hour, we're told they were there all day. And it's the 9th hour and the 11th hour groups that we're told were standing idle. Again, these were those that really didn't want to work. Now the question becomes this: what does this tell us about King Jesus and his kingdom? Because remember, that's what this is all about. The kingdom of heaven is like. I liken it into what Matthew tells us prior to this in chapter 13, verses 44 through 45. We're told this, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. And for the joy over it, goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, we talked about this earlier, but again, a lot of people, I think it deserves repeating. A lot of people will say, well, Jesus is the treasure and Jesus is the pearl. You got to sell everything and give it to him. You know, you just got to follow him blindly and you got to give him everything you got. The problem is, we don't have enough money to buy the field. This is actually, what Jesus is saying is the earth is the field and we are the treasure. And like the landowner who is going and looking for laborers to come into his field to help pick the grapes, what we see is that Jesus is seeking us out because he sees us as somebody with value and great worth, who he wants to bring into his field, into his pasture, to be a part of what he is doing. You see, what we learn about Jesus as king is that he's a king that is willing to not give the responsibility of seeking to somebody else, but he himself is willing to seek for us, which means he's willing to walk with us. That Jesus himself was willing to pay whatever it takes to get us to come into the field. And so how does this cause us, and how does this encourage us to live today in light of what's going on in our world? We should never look at the storms of life and get so discouraged that we give up. Rather, let us see the storm for what it is. Rain's coming. The Bible tells us rain falls on the just and the unjust. It's just a storm. We've all endured them. We've all overcome them. But let us see it for what it's worth, and let us follow the landowner into the field. And like the landowner, may we be moved with compassion, loving the sheep who have no shepherd. You see, that's what Jesus is doing. When you look at these people that were standing there, they were like sheep without a shepherd, and Jesus loved them. The second thing that we're going to see about King Jesus and his kingdom is that he was a generous giver, right? Verses 8 through 16. So when evening had come, the owner of the vineyard said to his stewards, "Call the laborers and give them their wages, beginning with the last to the first." And when those came who were hired about the 11th hour, they each received a denarius. Wow. You see, Jesus was about to teach his disciples something about the generosity and heart of the king. The heart of the king is different than the heart of those in the world. The heart of the king says to those that are in the 11th hour, those who have been idle all day, I'm elevating you to a place because you were willing to come even at the 11th hour, trusting that I was a good landowner. Here's your reward. He gives them the same. So at the end of the day, when it was time to pay up, the 11th hour worker got the same wage of the first hour guy's agreement. Talk about grace. They didn't deserve that much, but they got it anyway. And that grace reveals to us the generosity of the king. The king's heart, how he loves to bless his children. And I could just picture this next thing. If it was a true story, I could see this happening. I don't think Jesus was far-fetched in his description of what happened next. But when the first came, they supposed that they would receive more. Like, they were probably, licking their lips and like, oh, great, if they got this, well, let's see. They get one denarius, we've worked 12 times longer, maybe we're going to get 12 of them. They were trying to figure it out. They were pulling out their calculators if they had them. No, they didn't. Right, they were trying to figure out what are they going to get. So they supposed they were to receive more, and they likewise each received a denarius. And when they had received it, they complained against the landowner, saying, "These men have worked only 1 hour, and you made them equal to us, who have borne the burden and of the heat of the day." Man, I think it's interesting how it's only the first hour guys that complained. Right? That first group was the only group that complained. But was it really about the money? I think sometimes we would say, oh yeah, they thought they were being treated unfair, but really they agreed upon it. If they wanted to take Jesus to court, they would lose because they agreed upon this thing. They got what they agreed upon. They got what they wanted. They got what they deserved. So really, what were they so upset about? And I believe it's really the statement that says, "And you made them equal to us." I think they were more concerned with the fact that the 11th hour guys, the guys that they looked down their nose upon, who didn't work as hard as they did, were now elevated to the same place that they were in. And they did not like that. You see, I believe the issue is less about money and more about the landowner's elevation and grace upon these guys whom he loved just as equally. We got to be careful when we begin to compare people, because like Jesus said, the last will be first and the first will be last. And he uses this to show us his heart. Here is this generous giver. They forgot how generous God was. And they were hoping he would be something that he wasn't for them. But he answered one of them and said, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what is yours and go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as I gave to you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? Or is your eye evil because I am good? So the last will be first and the first will be last. For many are called, but few are chosen." So now the disciples are sitting back hearing this story. I wonder what they're playing in their mind. What's he trying to get across to us? Are we these guys? Are we complaining about what we agreed that we would get? Which guys are we? Are we the last? Are we the first? Are we somewhere in the middle? They're freaking out, I'm sure. They're totally overanalyzing it rather than saying, okay, God, what can I learn from this? You see, this is less about how they responded, and more about what it tells us about Jesus as king. We could try to figure out their response, but that's not what we're supposed to take from this. What we are supposed to take is, what does this tell us about King Jesus? Number one, it says, for many are called, but few are chosen. Uh-oh, now we can get into a whole different ball of wax, can't we? You want to have the debate? We can debate it till we're blue in the face. And you know what? Here's the thing. We got predestination. We got free will. We can argue. And you know what? I got friends on both sides, and I love them both. So what's my answer? Many are called, and few are chosen. Well, you didn't answer anything. Okay. But I still love you. You see, what we have here is an illustration of God's grace, not a definition about predestination and free will. What God wants us to see is that he is a generous, a grace-giving landowner, a landowner who is willing to sell everything and come and buy the field so that we could have access to him if we would put our faith in him. That's what we see here. Yeah, Jesus emphasized that God is calling and choosing, but they're both based on his grace, especially the choosing. So here we have it. He chose the first and he called the rest. They're all in the kingdom. Interesting, isn't it? You see, we need to understand that Jesus as a king sees things differently than we do, especially when it comes to people. Jesus sees people differently. But what we need to understand is that Jesus is a generous king who gives good gifts to those he chose and those he called. That's what's illustrated here. It's an illustration of the king. But yet, what do we do now? Living in this kingdom, but yet living for a different kingdom. Well, number one, we hold on to and follow the generous king, and we act like him. So what do? We follow our landowner, Jesus, doing what he did. He lavished his grace by elevating the marginalized and blessing those he called. You see, really what he's showing us is this. We should use money to love people, not love people to use money. Right? We love people and use money, not use people and love money. That's what we do. You see, we need to remember Jesus sees people as people to be loved, and he gave his life generously, which is what we'll look at in the next section, as we see how Jesus was our sacrificial king. So now the story's over. He tells them this story. They're probably sitting there scratching their head, wondering, okay, what's next for us? I have a lot more questions than I have answers to. And, well, verse 17. Now Jesus, going up to Jerusalem, took the 12 disciples aside on the road and said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and to scourge and to crucify. And on the third day, he will rise again. So now King Jesus reveals his plan on how he's going to purchase the field to get the treasure. It's going to cost him his life. Now, again, this is so important. Context. These guys going to Jerusalem would not have surprised them. It's what they would have done. They would have headed towards Jerusalem because Passover was coming. And they couldn't just hop in a car and drive there. They were walking. It took some time. So Jesus used what these guys normally would be doing to teach them something special. I hear people often say this, I just don't hear God speaking to me. Why is that? And there's many things that could be the issue. I mean, are you living in sin? Is your ears plugged? Are you just reading just to do there's so many things. But I think for whatever reason, we think that when somebody says that God spoke to me, that it happened like it happened with Moses up on the mountain with thunderstorms and lightning and just this big booming voice. And if we don't hear it that way, then God must not be speaking to me. But yet oftentimes the Bible talks about the still small voice of God. And so here's what I think. I think that when people say that God isn't speaking to me, it's because we expect thunder and lightning to accompany Jesus' communication. When in reality, what we see is that Jesus oftentimes speaks to us in that still small voice in the midst of our daily routines. We don't have to have those mountaintop experiences all the time, though we can have them and they're good, but we don't live on the mountaintop. We got to come down the mountain. And if God only speaks to us on the mountain, living in the valley is going to be horrible. But what we see here is that Jesus speaks in the routines of our life. See, this was normal for Jesus and his disciples to journey to Jerusalem. They'd done it before. And I'm sure he spoke to them on the way there before. But here, this time, he pretty much talks about how he's going to be the Passover lamb. So as they're headed to celebrate Passover, that means they're bringing lambs with them. It would all be connecting. It would be clicking. And I would imagine these guys were a bit confused about his teaching. But really what Jesus is saying is this. I'm telling you that the first will be last and the last will be first. And I'm not going to ask you to do something that I'm not willing to do. So then he talks to him about the cross. And how he's going to lay his life down, how he's going to be crucified, how he will become last so that we might be first, that we could be in his kingdom. Philippians 2, 5-8 puts it this way, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking on the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. You see, Jesus humbled himself and became our sacrificial lamb, making him our sacrificial king. He became last. But we need to be careful. You see, sometimes what we like to do is we talk about the cross, but we do it without mentioning the resurrection. But know this, Jesus never talked about the two separate. I mean, he talked about separately, yes. But when he was talking about himself being crucified, he always mentioned the resurrection. Why? Because it's the resurrection of Jesus Christ that brings us hope. If all we do is live with this crucified state, then we will have no hope. Yes, Jesus came to die for our sins and deal with sins and da-da-da-da. But if there is no life to replace the life that was lost in the death, there is no life. We need to live. We need to have life. We can't throw and separate the resurrection from the crucifixion. Often I hear people saying, well, it's really hard to be a Christian. And I thought about that this week. I was kind of scratching my head thinking about it. We had our last week up at Christian Bray, and this group of kids that was up there this week was just so sweet. And we got to see my granddaughter, who's like 70, but she called me grandpa. Like, I'm not that old, but, all right, but it was just really, really sweet to hang out with this group that was up there. And I started thinking, here's a group of people that have various disabilities. And we would look at them and be like, oh, how could God allow that to happen? Why are people born with disabilities if God's a loving God? But I'll tell you what, I learned more about the love of Jesus Christ this last week hanging out with people that didn't care what you thought about them? Though they struggled with it. I had one kid ask me, hey, I prayed for God to take my disability away and he hasn't. Why not? How do you answer that? And my point is this. Yes, it's tough being a Christian, but could you imagine going through life without the hope of the resurrection? What could I tell this guy? I had another kid ask me this. Seriously, he said, when do I get my resurrected body? And as I'm looking at this guy missing a leg, really struggling, I'm like, not today, but sometime, and probably very soon. He goes, yeah, I know that. And here's a guy that is literally trusting everything he has on this new body that he was promised. And here I am. That's an afterthought to me. Yeah, going through life without the hope of the resurrection would be horrible. If you think life's tough following Jesus, try not following him. Try going through life not following him. And what you'll find is that you will go through the same struggles, and you will struggle the same as you did as a Christian, but you'll go through those difficult times without hope. Life is tough. It doesn't matter who we are. It's just tough. The difference is we as Christians go through those tough times with a solution, with a king who sacrificed himself to elevate us, to give us hope that he's a God that's still working today. Because the truth of the matter is we all have people in our lives that are close to us that we love, that we know are making bad choices. We see how they're struggling. We see how their hurts are very real. And if we don't have the hope that God is still working, that God is still raising from the dead a life that is stuck in sin, what do we have? Here's something kind of crazy. I just wanted to share it with you. But Melnik II, he was the emperor of Ethiopia. Has anybody heard about him? He was there from 1889 to 1913. Well, he heard that in Europe and America, criminals were executed with an effective new device called an electric chair. So he heard about the electric chair. So you know what he did? He ordered 3 of them. Had 3 of them delivered to Ethiopia. When they showed up, he was super excited. He opened them up, he put them all together, and then he realized this. They needed electricity to work. And Ethiopia had none. A little bit disappointed. What he did is he commanded those around him. He said, this is what I want you to do. Put them together, put 1 in my kingdom and put 2 in my garden. Because I'm going to rule from this chair. And so for the next 15 years, he sat on an electric chair when he issued his proclamations. He turned the electric chair into a throne. Isn't that what Jesus did with the cross? When Jesus went to the cross, he did something greater than that. You see, he turned an instrument of death into the pinnacle of the power that is able to transform our shame into salvation, our rejection into redemption, and our grief into glory. Let that sink in for a moment. He didn't just rule from an electric chair. He changed lives. This guy may have made an electric chair a place where he could watch something like flowers and where he could rule from, but Jesus did something far greater. He's the one that made that garden beautiful as the death of that seed produced life. And as he as a king served us faithfully as a result of the cross. And so what does this tell us about King Jesus? It tells us that Jesus is our sacrificial king who gave himself generously as he pursued those he gave value to, like the pearl of great price, and as he purchased the field to get the treasure which he loved, which is you and I. So this should cause us to live for a different king in a different kingdom. And in doing so, we need to understand this, that living for a different king in a different kingdom, it's going to be sacrificial. But know this, it will also be life-bearing. It will bring fruit. It will bring life. But the only way that it'll bring life is as we trust in the resurrection power of Jesus. Trusting that he is still saving lives today. And so we trust in the resurrection while waiting for Jesus to produce the life that only he can bring in lifeless situations. So let's remember King Jesus, our sacrificial king, who is a generous giver, who seeks those whom he loves. And let's never forget that. And may that be what marks our lives as we live in this kingdom, but we live for a different king in a different kingdom. And may we bring and model to the world around us the truth about our King Jesus, how he loves us, he pursues us, he sacrificially gave his life for us, and he's now seated on the throne praying for us. I had one kid ask me this weekend, well, where's Jesus? I said, he's in heaven. He says, what's he doing? I said, he's praying for you. And he looked at me and he said, really? And I said, yeah. He then looked at me and said, everything's going to be all right then. So know that. Everything's going to be all right.